Hello and welcome to Inside Iraq. I'm Jassim Azzawi. Reports indicate the Pentagon is drawing plans to attack Iran, a routine procedure or an indication of a regional war before President Bush ends his term. If Iran's nuclear dream goes up in smoke, will U.S. soldiers in Iraq become Iran's favorite target? And will the Iraqi government and militias side with the mullahs in Tehran or the great Satan? Rawi Raga reports.
All options are on the table.
All options are still on the table.
If you're in Iraq and trying to kill our troops, then you should consider yourself a target.
If there's one thing the U.S. administration has made clear in its policy toward Iran, it is the U.S. has the option of carrying out a military strike on Iran. Recent reports indicate that if the attack were to take place, it's not about Iran's nuclear ambitions. Rather, it's about its alleged role in backing Iraqi fighters and providing weapons that end up killing American soldiers. But can the country currently embroiled in the Iraq war and the source of so much resentment across the world carry out another military strike?
Iran is not Iraq. Iran is different. Iran is not Afghanistan. And at the same time, I believe the American people fed up of the corpse of their girls and boys coming from Iraq.
Reports suggest there's internal dissent within the Bush White House over what course of action the administration should take against Iran. On one side, proponents of a more aggressive approach led by Dick Cheney have recently been able to get the State Department to label Iran's Revolutionary Guard a terrorist organization. But what would a strike on Iran mean on America's endeavors in Iraq and the broader Middle East in general?
Iran will not attack only Israel, but the American installation in the Gulf. That's mean Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Bahrain, all the countries.
It's highly unlikely that a U.S. strike on Iran could encourage the Iranian regime or the Revolutionary Guards to change their ways. In fact, it's likely to cause a surge in sympathy toward Iran around the Arab world and from Iraqi politicians and clerics. A possible influx of Arab fighters could be expected. If the United States has learned anything from its endeavor in Iraq, there better be an idea this time around about what's to follow a possible strike on Iran. Rawi Raga for Inside Iraq.
To examine whether a U.S. military strike against Iran is a rumor or hard fact, I am joined from Washington by New Yorker magazine reporter Seymour Hersh. Welcome to Inside Iraq. Mr. Hersh, in your article you said that plans by the Pentagon are being redrawn, perhaps selecting specific targets for the U.S. military to strike. Is this part of a regular routine procedure, or this is driven by political consideration in Washington, D.C., as well as hard facts on the ground in Iraq?
Well, it's beyond just normal. There's, of course, always contingency planning. In other words, my government's always planning for everything, every contingency possible. But in the case of Iran, it's a little more complicated, and it's gone well beyond the normal contingency planning into what the military would call operational planning. And this has been going on, as you know. I've been writing the same story now for almost 2.5 years. The planning traditionally, until recently, the American planning was targeted largely at the Iranian nuclear facilities, Natanz and other places that were very hard targets. Natanz, for example, is 75 feet underground. And that was the planning until what I reported in the New Yorker this week is that there was a sudden change this summer for a number of reasons. They decided the American government would no longer target primarily Iran's nuclear facilities, but instead go after the Revolutionary Guard.
Wouldn't that be the same for Iran? I mean, if American fighter bombers, they come and bomb targets within Iran, it doesn't make much difference to them whether they are hitting, the Revolutionary Guards or the nuclear facilities. Wouldn't the response by Iran would be the same regardless?
Washington's thinking is that they have been telling the world for the last 2 or 3 months that the Revolutionary Guards are responsible for indirectly, with supplies and ammunitions and guidance, responsible for the deaths of American soldiers and British soldiers, coalition soldiers in Iraq. And that has been a new thesis put out by this president for the last, as I say, since early summer, that Iran is directly involved in the problems we're having in Iraq. The British say the same thing about the problems they had in Basra. As you know, they're leaving the south gradually. not so gradually, and they blame the Iranians too. Of course, the case isn't that clear. So the thinking is that the American public would accept a cross-border raid, a raid on revolutionary camps, and some of our allies, the Britain in particular, might even go along with the idea of limited raids. So from the American point of view, this is a huge change from what we call counter-proliferation.
If that is the case, Mr. Hirsch, what would be the spark in order to precipitate this military strike? Would it be some sort of miscalculation by Iran? Would it be an increase in the EPF and the IID, or even the money or training for the militias? Like you said, you know, you've been writing about this for 2.5 years, and perhaps the last 2 articles indicated somehow there might be a military strike against Iran. President Bush leaves office January 20th, 2009. He's a lame duck perhaps next year. Will this be indicated or driven by time, or driven by other factors like Cheney, as you suggested in your article?
Well, one of the things that would certainly trigger it would be if the Iranians did something across the border, made a serious raid. I quote one American general as saying it would take 10 dead soldiers and 4 burned trucks, and that would be enough of a casus belli. That would be a justification. There's no evidence that Iran has done any military action across the board. There's also no evidence. There's a great dispute, as I said, about the extent to which the Iranian arms and etc. aid is any different than it was over the last 20 years.
They are not that stupid, are they, Mr. Hirsch, to give Mr. Bush the casus belli, as you said, you know, for Cheney and co, you know, to start, you know, driving the president as well as the other establishment to say, this is it, this is what we've been looking for, let's go after them. The Iranians, so far, they have been extremely careful. Their calculus is very meticulous. While it's true they are supporting the militias with military training and arms and money, and yet even commanders on the ground are saying that it is not very explicit.
Well, you know, there is always Ahmadinejad, which is the Americans can always fall back on him, but I don't think his statements are going to be enough of a driving force. It certainly doesn't help Iran's position in America when he you know, does things like challenge the Holocaust. That's quite foolish in my book, but that isn't a military action. And I think you're right. So far, the Iranians have been very, very careful about what they do, and the aid they provide, particularly to their fellow Shiites in the south, is essentially the same aid they've been providing since Saddam was in power and putting his foot on the neck of the Shiites all the time. So there's always been a tremendous tie, as everybody in your audience knows, between the Shias of Iran and the Shias of Iraq. And that, unfortunately, is America's dilemma.
I don't know whether President Bush is a poker player or not, but when you play poker and, you know, pretty much as the game comes to a close and you lose all your money, oftentimes poker players, you know, they double down, you know, they put the last chip they have on the table with a view of recouping their earlier losses. Is the president perhaps that kind of a guy? The dominant thinking in this region is, since the president made a huge calamitous gamble in Iraq and he lost, the only way he can recoup his credibility and perhaps some interest for the United States is by going after Iran. Does that play in Washington?
Well, that's certainly the concern of some of the people with whom I talk. That is that there's a fear that the president, this may not be necessarily a rational act. There's a tremendous opposition. But, you know, I just happened to have breakfast with somebody this morning who knows the Pentagon, who described people there worried in the military, worried about what they see as a messianic president. I have no idea what George Bush is really thinking on the inside. I can just tell you that I've been watching this president for a long time. And the one thing that is interesting about George Bush is I do believe him when he says things. He said he was going to go into Iraq, and he's making threats to Iran right now. He's constantly threatening them, and he's saying in private, he's making it clear in private that he would very much like to go. That I report some of that in the article in the New Yorker this week.
Political analysts, including Mr. Anthony Cordesman, they have this theory that right now it does not make sense for the United States to attack Iran, especially its nuclear facilities, simply because we don't know the extent of that facility, how well advanced it is. Perhaps it's about 5 to 8 years away, as Mr. Al-Barad'i of the IAEA says. So why attack it now? Why don't let the Iranians spend the money and the energy and bring it almost to full fruition to about 90%, 95%, and then the next president has the luxury of attacking it and get Iranians to spend another 20, 30 years in order to bring it back again. What do you think of that theory? Because simply the military and strategic assets right now, they do not exist in the region. Most of the carriers have gone.
You can ask me questions, hypothetical questions all week. What I do in my articles and when I do interviews, I try to stick. I'm not a theorist, and when it comes to guessing about what's going to happen, I will tell you that I think it's very likely, and from what I understand, this President George Bush sees himself as the man. And he's not sure that the next president, whether Democrat or Republican, would have the integrity in his view or the courage in his view and his belief to do what he can do.
Given the fact that this final act by President Bush might not be played according to some sort of calculus and logic, I was surprised and kind of fascinated by a quote you have in the article, Shifting Targets, by somebody saying Cheney does not give a rat's ass about the Republicans. So this is above and beyond politics right now, which is driven by some sort of a special agenda within a certain group within the White House and executives?
Oh yes, I don't think there's any question. There are many people who believe that any rational assessment of the situation would preclude going to Iran. There's just too many things. Iran has too much potential to strike back. I quote I saw some senior, for this article I was in Europe, and I saw some senior European intelligence officials who believe Iran would not strike back at America or Israel, but would strike asymmetrically other targets, perhaps oil targets and gas targets in the Gulf to drive the price up, perhaps go back to terrorism and even trigger activities against American or Europeans in Europe or even Latin America, bring in Hezbollah perhaps.
Mr. Seymour Hersh of the New Yorker magazine, thank you for being a guest on Inside Iraq. We will take a short break now, and when we come back, we will talk to two experts, an American and an Iranian. Stay with us.
No president at any juncture in history has ever taken military options off the table. Dan Bartlett, White House spokesman.